What was training like for you coming up? I saw that you started MMA when you were 19, so
Yes.
pretty young. So for you transitioning from wrestling to MMA as a teenager, what was that like, and then what was the training like for you to try to get better?
And so much of it was in your mind. Like if I was to tell you my story and you go, wow, that sounds crazy. It does, but that's what everybody else was doing. So if you could somehow be associated with a wrestling team, maybe the junior college or something like this. I happen to still be part of a wrestling program, and then you would go get a guy to hold mitts for you, and that was your boxing workout. So maybe you get that once a week, or maybe you made a really fancy guy, and he could do hands and feet, but you never considered sparring. That was not a thing. There was not a gym called an MMA gym. You might find some boxers where they would let you come in if you did it for free, then they would just beat the hell out of you. And then you get your wrestling in. Most guys' groundwork was moving your coffee table out in the living room, and you and a buddy are dropping into positions. And then if you could find a fight 2 or 3 times a year, your opponent was in that exact same spot. And there wasn't weigh-ins, and there wasn't commissions, and there generally be like in the rules meeting, you go, hey, at this weight class, are we doing heel hooks? Are we doing toe holds? And the guys would just show their hands. But the referee would never write it down, or however, you just had like this agreement with your partner. I don't know if I explained that very well, but I went out and fought a guy, and I was convinced I was going to be the champion. I remember the girl that I took to prom. I told her I was going to be champion because to lose, you have to tap out, and I will never tap out. I remember telling her this. So I'm going to be champion. I watched this guy fight called Don Fry, and he wrestled some at Oklahoma State, and he came out, and he was this boxer, his boxing guys, and when I would move around my living room, I was like Don Fry, and I'm going to hit him just like I saw Don Fry do. I'm going to get in, and I'm going to grab him and take him down just like I saw Don Fry do, and I believed that. So I got into the ring for my first fight. I never touched the guy once. I have no idea how hard it is to actually hit a target that's moving, let alone how exhausting it is to bounce around in this position that I've never done. And that fight was so hard, but he was in the same spot. He sucked just as bad as I did. 5 years later, they rematched us in the UFC.
Wow.
And yeah, we were just two guys that agreed to show up to this event. So then when I got out of college, we were one of the top gyms around. We only had 3 or 4 guys, but Evan Tanner, rest his soul, went on to be world champion. And Matt Lindland never got the belt, but he was actually ranked #1. Dan Henderson had a couple of belts from Pride, and Randy was the on and off UFC champion at 2 different weight classes. And this was our room, but we didn't have a coach. We would show up every day at 3, and then it would be, somebody would ask, are we going big gloves or little gloves today? And then it was like a popular opinion. We put our gloves on, and then the clock just went ding every 5 minutes. So you had one warm-up round, and then we just sparred, and we just went home. And as silly as that was, Randy was the world champion. Dan had beaten Matt was ranked #1. Evan was the world champion. Like, that theory actually worked. And way down the road, we had some weekend where Dan got beat on Friday in Japan, and Randy got beat on Saturday in Las Vegas. And we decided by Monday, like we had this huddle up at this coffee shop at the MGM Grand on Sunday that starting Monday, we're going to warm up together at a certain time, and then we're going to work on technique. And we had no idea who was going to show us this technique, but that's how wrestling practice was. And then we're going to go live, and then we're going to condition. And like, this was a really big deal to get us to do that, but nobody knew that MMA was a sport. It used to be, man, if this guy had a big tattoo, he was the tougher guy. Or like, if this guy could bench press, a couple pounds more than you, he was a bigger badass. Like, we actually believed that around town. That carried over to the octagon. Have you ever ran into a guy that was missing front teeth? Forget it. Just make him the champion. That was the best dude around. But we actually believed these things. All we had was Hollywood. There was no frame for a base of reference. There was no gyms. There was no trading and moving around. In Oregon, I've been a little wordy on this, but I just think you might think this is interesting. You can find a black belt everywhere now. Anywhere in America, there's a black belt somewhere in that town. Back then, we had 2 guys, and they were both purple belts. In fact, their father was Mackenzie Dern's, I apologize, their coach is Mackenzie Dern's father. And they would catch a plane out to Arizona 1 weekend a month, and they would learn these jiu-jitsu holds. And they were purple belts, but they owned the only jiu-jitsu gym in town. Like, there was no purple belts. There was no brown belts. There was no black belts. These were the highest guys. And they were purple. I mean, it was just a very different time. In fact, in 1994, when I started college, there was 6 Gracie certified black belts in all of America.
Wow.
Rickson Gracie had just fought Mark Schultz. They got into a fight, which I heard about, and this is before the internet was a thing. This is a year before people had what's called email. And I heard about this. I went and signed. I went and wrestled with Mark Schultz at BYU.
Wow.
All because he fought Rickson Gracie. He actually lost the fight.
Yeah.
But I knew it was the closest thing I could get to a Gracie. I went and wrestled for Mark.
So you knew you wanted to fight from a young age. It was like, you were like, what was so did you get into wrestling because you wanted to fight then, or what was the motivation?
No, I stayed in wrestling. So there was always a debate going on who the baddest dude in the world was. Was it the wrestling champion, who at that time was Bruce Baumgartner, or was it the boxing champion, who at that time was Mike Tyson? And my dad told me, and my dad's an old wrestler, he told me it's the boxing champion. He told me that Mike Tyson would beat Bruce Baumgartner's ass. And we searched everywhere to find a boxing gym, and we could not find one. They're not easy to find now. Like, boxing gyms bring in such low revenue, they don't have signs up front, they don't have, ads out in the paper. We simply couldn't find one. So we ended up with wrestling as a default. And then there was something called the Ultimate Fighting Championship that came along when I was a junior in high school. And that was the thing where my father and I both realized that whoever is the best at that is the baddest dude in the world. It's not the wrestler. It's not the boxer. It's that. And I made my transition right there. That day, I made my switch.
Wow. That's interesting. So you kind of, that timing is so cool because it really became a thing after you had already had some experience in combat sports, and you were almost looking for it as it happened in real time.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, I got so lucky timing wise, and your era is more lucky than mine. But the guys that came through just before me, like Mark Kerr and Mark Coleman, there's one of the greatest fighters ever, gets no credit. His name is Frank Shamrock, and they were fighting, and they were really good at fighting at a time when people weren't watching fighting. It was still in the dark ages. The place called MMA.TV, but that controlled our sport. Everybody from Dana White was on there lining up fights. That's where it happened. If you called somebody out, you called them up on this, on the Underground Forum, it was called. And if there was a show or an event, that's where you found out, because there was no advertising. And don't forget, I mean, the internet was hard. The internet was a very rare thing for people to have. There was no such thing as a smartphone. So getting this information was difficult. And fortunately, just right at the cusp, as I was coming through, then pay-per-view took over, and now we've got it on linear television and .coms and streaming apps. But that was not even a thing. That was not a thing when you started college, Bo. When you started college, people weren't streaming. There was nothing called Fight Pass out there. There was no ESPN Plus even out there. So the world is going quickly, but I do thank goodness that I happen to be kind of part of that time.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you were actually you were ahead of your time, because not only were you a fighter and, be able to have the skills, but you also were, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my opinion, the first person to actually like promote themselves, and the first person to be like, I'm going to promote this fight. Like, tell the guy like, hey, I'm going to whoop your butt, and there's nothing you can do about it. And then people were like, what? You can say that type of stuff before the fight's going on? Like, you can talk trash this is crazy.
Yeah.
And so talk to me about like how that kind of came about. And was that just your personality naturally, or did you have to work at it? Like, it seems natural. So what was that about?
I know I've seen other guys do it. I mean, it's like anything. You see somebody else, and so you start copying it. But I was never a sports fan. To this day, I have never seen a Super Bowl. I've never watched a total basketball game. I even bought season tickets to a semi-pro hockey, and I had to get up and leave. I never made it to a bowl game. But I have seen every political debate you could think of, like all of the boring ones, and the senator versus this senator in the state of Massachusetts 10 years ago. I've watched all of those. And I was always interested in the fight, in the absolute fight that they're going to have. One person is going to leave that stage the winner. One person is going to leave that stage the alpha, but they're never going to touch each other. It's only a debate on ideas and quirks and words and tone and effect. And I was interested in that. Oh my God, I love the presidential cycle every 4 years. I love that whole thing back and forth from a fight perspective, but I know they're never even going to touch one another. So I got into that. I wanted to talk like the man on the 6 o'clock news. I remember the first day of school, they would always have every day was the same thing. Every year, first grade, second grade, third grade, but you write down on the piece of paper, what are you going to be when you grow up? And every year until my junior year of high school, I wrote President of the United States.
Wow.
My junior year, I wrote Governor of Oregon because I realized I like this state. I don't want to leave it. But I only say from that perspective, like that was interesting to me. The guys that I used to watch, even the Hulk Hogan's, for example, and I wasn't as big of a wrestling fan as people have made it out to be, but I did appreciate that. I did appreciate when there was something to look forward to. And my favorite fighter for a brief period of time, but was Tank Abbott. But Tank was really the first. A lot of people say it was me, but I got influenced by Tank.
Okay.
And Tank was just doing it at a time when there wasn't a lot of people watching, but he was the first one to say this is not about honor and this is not about respect. This is a fist fight in a steel cage for the applause of a drunken audience. And, you know, it was one of these interesting things where just conceptually, I always felt that he was right. I've never seen an honor in telling somebody that, you know, something nice to their face and then stabbing them in the back when they turn around. I find an honor in telling them when you turn around, I'm going to put a knife in your back. I think that's more honorable.